Hi, my dear friend. I'm so happy to see you here. If this is your first visit, please subscribe and share this video with friends and family. It really means the world to me. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. I read and value all your comments. Let's jump right in. Mark Howard had long valued the comfortable rhythms of routine. A decade spent with Abigail meant he could predict the aroma of coffee drifting through the house before she left, the exact way she zipped her bag shut, and the subtle variations in her smiles that hinted at her moods. But when the call came that morning, that steady foundation felt suddenly unsteady. It was Abigail's sister Rebecca on the line, bringing news that their old literature teacher, Miss Jenkins, had passed away in Cedar Falls. Miss Jenkins had done more than introduce them to novels and verse. During a bleak chapter when their father had moved far away and their mother worked overnight shifts to keep the family going, she had offered them a refuge. When the call ended, Abigail exhaled slowly, then quietly told Mark she would be going. No discussion followed, no asking if he agreed, only a calm resolve. Some griefs demand candles, wordless embraces that last a little too long, and a silence shared between those who remember. Though he dreaded the house feeling empty, Mark contained his feelings. He told her he understood, promised to tend the garden and care for the dog. She gave his hand a brief, firm squeeze before turning to pack. The next morning, before the sun was fully up, Rebecca arrived, honking impatiently from the driveway. She jumped out, helping Abigail load her familiar blue suitcase into the trunk, carefully arranging a bouquet of white flowers they planned to leave at the cemetery. From the window, Mark watched their preparations intently. When Abigail came back inside briefly for her coat, he wrapped her in a long hug, softly asking if she had enough cash, her painkillers, and her phone charger. She nodded, promising to call when she arrived. Then she stepped outside, pulled the car door closed, and with that, half of Mark's world drove away, shrinking into the distance between rows of telephone poles. The journey to Cedar Falls took 6 hours, the atmosphere thick with shared memories and quiet reflection. Cedar Falls, a town shaped by its river and old mills, still carried the scent of damp wood. The sisters checked into Willow Creek Inn, a long-favored retreat for the town's older residents. As Abigail stepped from the car, the crisp, pine-scented air stirred memories of teenage dances and David Walters, her first boyfriend, whom she hadn't seen since adolescence. Rebecca joked that they might run into him at the wake. In a small town, everyone turned up for such things. Abigail rolled her eyes but felt an odd tension, as though she was walking down a dim hallway, bracing for an unseen hand on her shoulder. The next day, the church was filled to capacity. In between warm embraces, shared memories of Miss Jenkins, and the faint scent of melting candle wax, Abigail spotted David standing near a wall of old photographs. His hair now threaded with gray, and his face lined softly. He looked almost professorial, but his smile was unchanged, wide, shy, a little apologetic. The moment he saw her, recognition lit his face. He pulled her into a hug, brief and polite, yet she felt the warmth linger long after. Rebecca, observing from across the aisle, raised a knowing eyebrow but said nothing. After the service, mourners gathered at the school gymnasium for coffee and slices of pie. David sought Abigail out again, bringing up old school plays and the time they had accidentally broken a projector. Her laugh rang out louder than she intended, drawing Rebecca's gaze from across the room as she distributed cake slices. That night, back in their twin-bedded room at the inn, Abigail scrolled through the day's photos when a notification caught her eye. David had found her on social media and sent a message. "Good to see you again. Coffee tomorrow?" It read. Her pulse quickened, though she left the note unanswered for the moment. When Rebecca emerged from the bathroom, towel wrapped around her hair, she noticed the flush on Abigail's face and gently asked if everything was all right. Abigail blamed tiredness, but her sleep that night was restless, disturbed by the slow ticking of an old wall clock. The following morning, Rebecca left early for the market to pick up fresh flowers for the gravesite. Still in her pajamas, Abigail finally composed a reply. "I can meet you at 10, downtown cafe." That decision felt heavy, like stepping over an invisible line. She opened her makeup bag slowly, unsure whether she was hiding or revealing something. At Riverstone Cafe, she spotted David easily in a quiet corner. She sat down, and soon hours slipped by unnoticed as they talked about careers, relationships, and unfulfilled dreams. David confessed that he had never married, that every relationship he'd tried had fallen apart. When Abigail mentioned Mark, her voice softened, nearly disappearing beneath the swirl of steam from her cappuccino. David's gaze dropped to her fingers, where her wedding band gleamed faintly. His smile was gentle, touched with wistfulness, as he asked if she'd join him for a walk to the dam bridge, where birds gathered every afternoon. Abigail hesitated only briefly, thinking of Rebecca and the burial scheduled for later that day, but then she found herself agreeing. At the bridge, the breeze brought with it the clean scent of the river. David leaned on the railing, telling her how Miss Jenkins had quietly supported him when his father lost his job, his voice faltering as emotions surfaced. Without thinking, Abigail reached out and touched his arm, a small gesture that felt like a spark, awakening something inside her. Before she could process it, David turned toward her and kissed her. It was slow and intense, as if indifferent to the rush of water beneath them. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, but she ignored it. The kiss deepened, drawing them into a close embrace, which soon led them back to a small room at the back of the cafe, David's photography studio. When the door closed behind them, Abigail let herself fall into the past, vivid and unreachable. Afterward, she sat quietly at the edge of the makeshift bed, pulling her clothes back on and gathering herself. She told David she couldn't miss the burial. He promised to keep her secret. Abigail rushed back to the inn, quickly changing into a fresh blouse, rinsing her face, and meeting Rebecca, who was already ready to leave. She offered a hurried explanation, saying she'd lost track of time while wandering. Rebecca found the excuse odd, but said nothing, urgency outweighing curiosity. At the graveyard, they stood together. Abigail cried appropriately, or perhaps too much, and maybe for reasons she couldn't admit aloud. In the following days, they didn't cross paths again. Abigail stayed away from town, and Rebecca, distracted by paperwork, didn't notice her sister's anxious retreat. By Saturday, they returned home. Mark waited at the door, holding back the eager dog as it circled him. His embrace was gentle, almost cautious, as he caught the scent of a perfume Abigail hadn't worn since her teenage years, a fragrance that seemed strangely misplaced. That evening, Abigail left her suitcase untouched in the corner, telling herself she'd unpack tomorrow. Though Mark encouraged her to rest, it was he who couldn't settle, pacing through the kitchen until late at night. On Monday, when Abigail came home from work, she found Mark seated at the kitchen table, 2 orderly stacks of paper in front of him. The dog lay curled nearby, as if deliberately positioned there. Without a word, Mark slid a heavy envelope toward her. Inside, divorce papers, already signed, and between the sheets, photographs, snapshots of her and David, holding each other on a bridge, entering a building hand in hand, leaving together after hours. The warm late-afternoon light in the photos left no doubt. Abigail felt her world tilt. She stumbled over excuses. It was only a brief mistake, a meaningless lapse. She still loved Mark. But he, his voice quiet and drained, told her that intent no longer mattered. The facts spoke for themselves. He suggested she contact a lawyer if she wanted to discuss property or belongings. She broke down, tried to reach for him, but he recoiled as if she burned him. When she asked how he found out, he explained that an anonymous email had arrived, photos attached, date stamped, untraceable. To Mark, the fact that someone else knew rendered trust irreparable. That night, Abigail wandered the living room, clutching the photographs, seeing herself from outside, as if she were a character in a poorly written tragedy. In the mirror, she caught a glimpse of a woman who had betrayed in silence. The next morning, she packed a small bag and took temporary refuge in a colleague's spare bedroom. The following weeks crawled by in a haze of signatures and decisions, splitting furniture, closing joint accounts. Mark sold the house and moved into a small loft near the university, claiming he needed air and distance. Abigail reached out, calls, messages, even letters, but he remained silent. 10 years of shared life reduced to boxes labeled and financial documents separated. During that period, Rebecca began checking in on Mark regularly. At first, she offered practical help, meals, picking up papers, but he politely declined. Then, one afternoon, he accepted her invitation for coffee at a small cafe near his office. Rebecca appeared in her work clothes, wearing a tired smile. As they spoke, Mark felt a strange comfort. Here was someone who understood the weight of grief from two different losses, a beloved teacher and a broken marriage. They reminisced about Cedar Falls, about Miss Jenkins, about how ties could snap without warning. Rebecca confessed she had long admired Mark's calmness, seeing him as the counterweight to Abigail's impulsive nature. Mark winced, both flattered and saddened. Their coffees became routine, soon leading to casual dinners, and eventually walks on Sundays with the dog. Neither of them defined what was happening, but in small gestures, a shared napkin, a brief touch as they stood side by side, a quiet tension grew. Mark struggled with guilt, feeling as if he was betraying Abigail despite their divorce. Rebecca, too, lay awake at night, haunted by one thought: what kind of sister falls for her sister's former husband? One day, after accompanying him to a medical appointment, Rebecca invited Mark to her apartment for dinner. They shared wine, spoke about old camping trips, and the evening grew softer, more intimate. Mark's loneliness felt, for a moment, as though it had lifted. He thanked her and left, but within days they gave in to the pull between them. Their relationship unfolded in quiet secrecy. When the day of the final divorce hearing came, Abigail and Mark sat in the quiet courtroom, signing away the last formalities. Abigail pinned her hair tightly with a metal clip, as though holding her entire life together. Afterward, she followed him outside, took a breath, and asked again who had sent the photos. Mark repeated that it had come from an anonymous, untraceable email address. She searched his face as if hoping to uncover a truth she would never know. Then she simply thanked him for handling the division with care, stepped into a waiting taxi, and left, taking with her any remaining chance of explanation. 2 months later, Mark and Rebecca decided to limit their time together to weekends to avoid attention. Even so, whispers began to spread through town. They tried to shop in distant neighborhoods, but one day they ran into one of Abigail's former colleagues at a supermarket checkout. The news traveled quickly. Abigail learned of this in the most painful way, on a sweltering morning in Phoenix, where she'd moved to rebuild her life. She opened an email from a friend back in Cedar Falls. The message was blunt. Your ex-husband was holding hands with your sister at the old neighborhood store. Her heart raced, her coffee turned bitter in her mouth. A couple of clicks later, she saw the photo. Rebecca and Mark sharing a shopping cart, smiling together, as if they belonged in some perfect family calendar. On a reckless impulse, Abigail purchased a ticket, determined to confront her sister in person. Her heartbeat quickened as she climbed the 3 flights to Rebecca's door. When Rebecca answered, disheveled and still wearing the creased t-shirt she had slept in, she seemed too startled to fabricate an excuse. Abigail crossed the threshold uninvited. The familiar scent of cinnamon hung in the air, which only fueled her anger. It was as if the apartment dared to remain unchanged, cozy and familiar, despite all that had transpired. Without hesitation, Abigail demanded an explanation. How long had Rebecca been spending her Sundays with Mark? Rebecca gestured toward the couch, inviting her to sit, but Abigail stayed stiffly upright, arms crossed, her glare hard with accusation. With deliberate care, Rebecca began recounting the beginning of her relationship with Mark, how it had emerged in the shared aftermath of loss, how grief had unexpectedly drawn them close. A bitter, sharp laugh escaped Abigail's lips as she remembered Rebecca's raised brow at the funeral, a look that now seemed to carry a sinister undertone. She accused Rebecca of waiting in the wings, poised for the right moment. Rebecca's hands trembled as she swore it had never been calculated, that all she had hoped for was Mark's healing. That word, healing, landed like a slap, sounding callous in a story founded on the ruins of another's heartbreak. Their voices rose, the intensity of their fight echoing down the hallway, loud enough to draw the attention of their neighbors behind their muted televisions. When Rebecca reached to touch Abigail's arm, Abigail recoiled instantly, as though her sister's fingers could burn her skin. Her voice broke as she reminded Rebecca of their childhood pacts, the whispered confidences and their solemn promise to always protect one another. Rebecca's tears spilled freely then, as she professed her love for Abigail and sorrow for the pain she had caused. But Abigail's fury was unraveling into exhaustion. She admitted that the deepest wound wasn't the betrayal itself, but the ease with which Rebecca and Mark had moved forward, leaving her excluded from their reassembled lives. Before turning to go, she fixed her eyes on Rebecca one last time. The question about the photographs, who had taken them, who had sent them, burned silently in her throat. But she swallowed it, choosing not to inflict any more harm that day. She stepped out into the corridor, leaving behind the cinnamon-scented air, descending the stairs quickly, knowing that, even without every answer, the ache in her chest spoke the entire truth. In the days that followed, on a sticky July night, Rebecca asked Mark to stay over. He arrived carrying a small bag, having left his dog with a neighbor. After they ate, they went to bed, and Rebecca lay awake beside him as cold moonlight sliced across the floor. She shifted restlessly, then rested her head on his chest, and quietly said she had something to confess. Mark's heart began to pound. He understood the weight behind her voice. Rebecca confessed that during the week of the funeral, she had noticed a strange intimacy between Abigail and David. Her suspicions had driven her to shadow them, snapping photographs of a stolen kiss and their discreet entry into a building together. She had returned to her inn shaking, haunted by the images she had captured. Days later, after wrestling with her conscience, she had created an anonymous email and sent the photos to Mark, convinced that he deserved to know, that Abigail should be held accountable for her own betrayal. But when she saw how shattered Mark had been, remorse had flooded her, though by then it was far too late to retract what she had done. Mark remained motionless, listening as her words hung in the quiet. He contemplated the complexity of loyalty, how love could so easily twist itself into a weapon for retribution. Softly, he asked why she hadn't simply come to him, why she had harbored this secret for so long. Rebecca admitted that she had feared the anger he might direct at her for delivering such painful news, and that perhaps old jealousy had also played a part, a long-standing admiration for him that had always hovered beneath the surface. Rising from the bed, Mark crossed to the window and gazed out at the empty street below, replaying the events of the past year, the betrayal that had undone him, the lonely separation, the shared meals with Rebecca that had helped him heal, and now this fresh wound, inflicted by the woman beside him. A tangled knot of compassion and resentment twisted within him, impossible to unravel. At last, he returned to the bed, took Rebecca's shaking hand in his own, but said nothing. Her tears fell silently onto the sheets between them. By morning, Mark brewed coffee and spoke with careful deliberation. He told Rebecca he needed distance to think. He expressed gratitude for her belated honesty, but admitted that their relationship had been built on shaky foundations, woven from guilt and unresolved resentment. Even if the affection between them was genuine, He no longer wanted to continue building on such fractured ground. He picked up his bag, pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, and walked out the door, uncertain if he would ever return. Rebecca stood motionless at the window, her trembling hands resting on the glass, watching as he turned the corner and vanished from sight. Time slipped past, and their lives diverged quietly. Abigail moved permanently to Phoenix, accepting a teaching role at a community college, slowly repairing her sense of self and her reputation. In the evenings, she wandered the dusty trails outside the city, whispering reassurances to herself that mistakes were part of being human, that people rebuild themselves over and over again. The weight of guilt clung to her like an iron brace, but still, she kept breathing. Rebecca traveled to Cedar Falls to stay with their mother, helping to mend the aging house, steering every conversation away from Mark. At night, she pored through old journals, searching for the origins of her longing for justice and how easily it had intertwined with desire. Meanwhile, Mark tended his loft with quiet precision, filling his days with pottery classes and long, solitary runs through the park. He found that silence could be a trustworthy companion when trust itself felt too delicate to offer anyone else. At times, he drove winding back roads, listening to astronomy podcasts, soothed by the idea that even stars died and were reborn, that the cosmos itself made space for destruction and renewal. Then, on a quiet Wednesday, an envelope with no return address arrived at his door. Inside was a single photograph, his dog, bounding joyfully along a beach, an old image that Abigail had taken long ago and forgotten on some device. Mark smiled softly, free of bitterness, tucked the photograph between the pages of a book, and stepped outside for a walk. Months later, at a farewell party honoring a colleague's retirement, Mark happened to encounter Rebecca again. Their interaction was brief and courteous. She offered a tentative, almost uncertain smile, and he responded with a soft one of his own. They spoke of her mother's health, the recent opening of a new school in Phoenix, and the pottery classes she had been attending. Neither mentioned the confessions or the promises that had once passed between them. When they said goodbye, it was with a careful, measured embrace. At that instant, Mark recognized that his feelings for Rebecca hadn't entirely disappeared, but he also understood that certain loves arrive at inopportune times and must eventually settle into a gentle, quiet affection. As the year waned, Mark sat alone on the balcony of his apartment, watching the first snowfall of the season drift down. The sharp chill filled his lungs as he breathed in, and he felt, after everything he had endured, a quiet sense of wholeness. He no longer longed to return to old chapters of his life, nor did he feel any urge for revenge. He had come to appreciate that even when difficult, truth is better than the false comfort of ignorance, though he also realized that truth itself can be shaped by the fears of the one who reveals it. Later that evening, he lit a small candle on the table beside him. His dog lay close, occasionally nudging his arm for affection. Mark stroked the dog's head slowly as he watched the flame sway gently. In that stillness, he came to understand that while some flames consume, others simply illuminate, and that it was up to him to choose which ones he would permit to burn. The flame remained steady as snow quietly cloaked the streets below, hinting, without promising, that even the deepest marks might one day be hidden by winter's quiet patience, offering a fresh canvas on which new journeys could begin when morning came. This story has come to an end. What's your opinion? Share it in the comments, my friend. And if you liked this story, check out other exciting videos on my channel. I'll say goodbye until the next video. See you.